Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Midewin National Tallgrass Prairie. And you're on the historic Rogers Schumacher Fairview Farm site, as you know. And this farm site is eligible for the National Register of Historic Places based on its research potential. And because Al and Bob, and I'll use their first names just because I don't know whether uncle or grandfather or dad or whatever, I'll just call them Al and Bob. Here, and your aunt, your late aunt Irma, here we're a part of something significant in American history, and we try to honor that. We try because we're part of the Department of Agriculture and the Forest Service. This is important to us to recognize this. So whether or not you've appreciated it before you came here, that means that you too are a significant part of trends and developments in American history. So congratulations to all of you. So this farmstead site, one of the earliest purchased pieces of land in Will County or in Northeast Illinois. The woods on the other side of Route 53 were called Reed's Grove. Charles Reed came in 1830 and filed a preemption claim on the land over there. He came with his adult family, and one of his sons, Elias Reed, bought this parcel of land as soon as it was available through the government land office, which was 1835. So in 1835 he had it, died of an illness in 1839. His brother took the property, sold it in 1842 to Michael Rogers. And that's the first recorded house we have here, is when the Rogers family owned it. So that's how, before we even knew there was a Schumacher family, 6, 10, 15 years ago, it got the name registered with a Smithsonian number of, or the name of the site is the Rogers Farmstead. When we finally met through Aletha Collins, first Al, then we got to know so much more about it. And some of you will be sad and some of you will be happy, but the family, these two, have donated a bunch of stuff from the farm to Midewin. We're going to see a couple of things today. I mean, some of you might look forward to having it in the future. Others might say, what am I going to do with the milk can? Where am I going to put this milk can? But it's to us significant because it's in the context of this site. The rest of the collection, probably stuff that was here when you were kids.
Yeah.
Is in our federal collections housed down at the Illinois State Museum Research and Collection Center, the federally approved repository for this part of the state. So we didn't know the other stuff was coming, so we're going to keep that separate so we can still use it and not have to take it out.
We have to give Joe a big thank you for showing up here on Saturday.
Wouldn't miss you.
Thank you.
I wouldn't miss the opportunity to see you all again.
Joe is the archaeologist and the tribal liaison.
Just letting you know that Al and I, the stories we're going to tell you, we were probably 5 or 6 or maybe even up to 10 years old when this period of time we're talking about. So things that we remember might be, but they might be things that other people told us too, so that we can remember.
We can give thanks to our parents for helping us, and I think, a couple 90-year-olds out here today, it's just wonderful to get together with the family. I have to say I'm very proud and very thankful that all of you have been here. I hope you enjoy what Bob and I have to say. So if you have questions, let us know. We'll help you.
Were you born at home or?
Okay, that's an interesting question. Were we born at home? Al was born at Silver Cross Hospital.
And Joliet.
Right. And with me, it's an argument between me and my sister. She's not here, so she's going to lose this argument. But she said she went to bed at night, and the next morning I was there. But so she thinks I was born at home, but my birth certificate says I was born at Silver Cross Hospital, and I think that's what we'll have to believe. So I was asking about the number of bushels of corn per acre. Well, in 1888, it was 30 bushels per acre. In 1930, when we were born, it was 30 bushels per acre. Well, it depends upon whether you were looking at the data from Iowa or Indiana or Illinois, because a different place had a different reading for that. But what would really be shocking to my father would be the number of bushels per acre that he could get now. Can you imagine? He would go out and pick this corn by hand, and if you're only picking 30 bushels per acre, it's a heck of a lot different from 300 bushels per acre, which is what they would get today. And when we did the corn picking, Dad was right alongside the wagon. The wagon with the 2 horses was being pulled along there, and if he needed to tell him to stop, he'd say, "Whoa," and then, of course, get up. But at 10 bushels an acre, he didn't have to stop him very often, because he picked 2 rows, Al picked a row, and I picked a row, except my dad had to come around and pick up after me because I was just a little guy and I needed a little more help than the rest of them did. But that I found quite interesting and a lot of fun. Now, one thing that some of you missed was I stopped the last group and told them that roadway there that we were on was the regular road that went past the farm, and we're going to be following it in a few minutes. And it you can see there's a little gravel on it here and there, but the road where where you turn to come up here, not far up the hill, was the entrance to the farm. And so they would pull off into this area. There's the house right behind me, but they would pull off up here and be past the house. And when they had a car, it was parked right here. And the rest of the farm buildings were around like so. I mean, I can point out over there is the chicken house, over there is the corn crib, and beyond that was the hog house, and over here was the milk house, and over this area was the barn where the major events occurred with the milking and the raising of young cattle and maintaining a place for the horses. Oh yes, that's what they had to have, horses and young stuff that wasn't old enough yet to have milk for commercial use. So anyway, so this road that came up here along this side of the farm was maintained. It's supposed to be, a county was supposed to maintain it, but the farmers usually did a lot of work on the roads that went past their place. So my dad found that this was an extra pasture for his cows. So at night, after he got done milking, not every night, but he would turn the cows loose along the road and they would mow the grass.
Yeah.
They also did the same thing for his barnyard or around the house. We didn't have these rotary mowers and that kind of thing in that day. And so the cows did a pretty good job of keeping that cut down for us. But he did have a 5-foot sickle mower that he used in the yard so that it would grass would be cut and looking pretty nice. He was always wanting things to look real good around his farm. He was a man who took pride in the work that he did. So I hope that Al and I have followed the same pattern and plan.
So we have representatives from 4 generations. Thank you. the house was built and they moved in 1924. They first came to this location in 1920, and there was a old unsatisfactory house that they lived in for the first years. And then Father and his farm laborers and hired bricklayers built the new house. And it was a modern home. And I have to thank Mr. Joe over here. He recognized in one of the pictures that it showed the telephone wire coming to the house. But the house was like 4 rooms downstairs and 2 major bedrooms upstairs. And Bob and I slept on the porch, over the porch. And that was our bedroom. So the 2 bedrooms upstairs, one was for Irma and the other was for the hired man. And Dad had a hired man virtually all the time because he was responsible for more of the field work. Dad, at 5 o'clock in the morning, was milking cows. And again, at 5 in the evening, milking the cows the second time. So that cut into his day of doing farm work. But he took his horses and went out and planted corn, cultivated it, mowed hay, and that was the thing that he used the 2 horses for. Bob?
Well, the story I was going to tell, I'll bring in now instead of at the end, but he talked about the room for the hired man. Well, we usually had, most of the time, Uncle Bert, our uncle, and he was Mother's brother-in-law. But the one I want to tell is about there was a man that we hired at intermediate time, and he was just with us a short time, and he was a young fella, and he served or lived in this one room, and my father didn't need this man anymore, so the neighbor needed him, and the neighbor down the street here at Kavanaugh said, send him down and we'll employ him. So they sent him down there and employed him, but now comes the shock. He killed the wife. He shot her. So maybe how fortunate Al and I and our parents were that he didn't do that to us. And what I recall is my mother wanted to go down there and see the place, and I went with her, and here I took my finger and I could put it in the door jamb where the bullet went. So that's just one of the tragedies I'm going to tell you about today. So I think at this time we're going to walk on down the road.
Can I make a comment there when
Yes.
you're talking about hired men?
Yes.
In the 30s, early 30s, Depression time, there were 40% of the men that didn't have jobs. And they would line up on the streets of Joliet, Illinois. And my dad would ask that Mother, and she would take Bob and I in the front seat of the car and drive to Joliet. And she would pick up 2 workers that would come down and with hose would help control the weeds in the cornfield or other grain crops. Now, can you imagine sending a 40-year-old lady to pick up 2 strangers, bring them down to the farm, giving them hose and putting them to work? But
What did they get paid?
Oh, they got a whole $1 a day. Yeah. And there was one fella that I remember that he came in like I was telling you about, but he was so interested in working that he would walk from Joliet starting at 3 in the morning to come down to the farm to get his $1. So,
The farmers had something to eat,
yeah.
and they had fuel for their stoves, but the people in town didn't. And there was no welfare. So, well, let's walk on down the road.
Did Arthur's family, his parents and brothers, did they live nearby?
They lived in southern Illinois.
Oh,
My mother's family lived nearby,
okay.
and
So
Verna,
Vernus.
yeah. Another thing about that is they had worked on this farm for 10 years, and they had saved enough money to buy a farm of their own. And of course, that went to the government also, so they didn't get to use that particular farm. But they were that prosperous that they were able to save the money over the 1930 to 1940 to buy a farm. So they were hardworking people.
Okay.
Well, and how they could accumulate money was that they had these dairy cows, 12 to 14 of them, and that brought them a check every month. Where 40% of the men were unemployed, at least Dad had some income month after month.
Well, as long as we're talking about that deal, do you know when you get old, you can't remember things?
You don't have to be old to do that.
You were talking about
The laborer on the farm, people that would come and work for a day and get $1 for taking a hoe and cutting the thistles in the cornfield. There was a commission in Will County, and that's the county we're in, that was set up to control Canadian thistles. They were the worst pest you could have on a farm. There was no chemicals to control them. So what you had to do was hire somebody with a garden hoe and go out and cut the thistles. Now you could cultivate, and it was set up that you could cultivate 2 directions, but the thistles were so dense and the roots were so long that it was very difficult to get rid of them. And you had to really work to get those under control. I would have to recall there was I'm getting off the subject
that's
here.
fine. It's all on the same subject.
When at the corner of the farm here on the west side, there's a pipeline that oil flowed through to go to the refineries up in Joliet and Lockport. Well, that pipeline was buried probably 6 feet or so down, and when the pipeline had a leak down by the corner near Route 53, which then was 66, they had to dig it up, and they had a trench that was then 6 feet deep. Well, you could go down there and you would see these thistle roots virtually all the way to the bottom. So they were a hard thing to control. And we didn't have chemicals like we have today to control that type of thing. Right, Bob?
That's right. We're going to move along to an open field over here, so let's move along. No, this way.
We're going down this path.
This way.
Oh. Okay. We're going cross country. We're going to move along a little ways.
Yeah, I just can't believe all these trees.
How much it's grown up?
Yeah. Well, it's been a long time, you know.
Yep.
Those black locusts, they have big seed pods, and
Yeah.
they drop the seed pods, and
And look what they create.
look what we have today.
Yep.
Just a forest of black locusts, and that's a nice tree. It's a hardwood-like tree, and of course, it made good firewood.
Yeah.
So here you can get a lot better feel for what this old road sort of would have looked like, except when Arthur Schumacher was here, he used to maintain these Osage orange trees. They planted Osage orange trees starting in about the 1840s, and they come from Osage country, Oklahoma, North Texas, down around that way where the Osage tribe is from. And the thought was you had to, at the time by Illinois law, you had to have some of your land fenced. That is to say, Illinois is a closed grazing state. You had to keep cattle out of it.
Yeah.
And they found out that by planting the Osage, took a couple of years' work to plant these things,
It's not a
but then it
sturdy
would
arm.
be not very high,
Thank you.
but are really dense, and these things here can get really, really thorny. So they get very thorny, very dense, and they used to advertise, you get yourself a 5-pound bag of seed, and it would be advertised in the Prairie Farmer as, was it horse high, bull strong, and hog tight. So, and this was still hedges up until the time Arthur lived here and left in 1940. And then the Army never used this stretch of road during the years that they were here from 1940 to 1996. We really didn't either. And this is what happens in 60, 70, 81 years of growth instead of hedges. So if you've got hedges at your house, beware. Do you want to, Al, did you want to talk?
Okay. Joe has an instrument there that my father built to help control the size of the hedge so that they could manage it. That was like an axe. It has a hook on the top, and the hedge was kept at about 4 feet or so high. And to do that, you had to chop off the sprouts that were growing up through there each year. And guess what? This guy right here and I, after he cut them off, we had to grab those sprouts. Some of them could be 6 or 8 feet long, and carry them over to a pile where they could be burned or somehow, worked back. But the hedge was very important. Along this road was this 4-foot high fence of hedge, and as Joe said, it was a tight fence. And then along the road going north and south, there was another hedge, so that encompassed the pasture, which was about 30 or a little more acres in size. On the running east and west on the south side of this pasture, those trees, which were Osage orange trees, were allowed to grow to be adult trees. And from there, they could cut wood that they could use also in their cook stove, in the kitchen, and the furnace to heat the house in the wintertime. Joe's got the bow here that was made for Bob and I. This came from wood from this tall tree that was growing along that south edge of the pasture. In 1924, Dad, they built a house, but they also cut logs out of this row of trees and piled them up. So like in late 1930s, those logs were still there. A couple of men out of Joliet, I believe it was, found the logs and knew that they were aged, and they came down and worked out a deal with Dad to take some of those logs back to their shop, and from that they made us some bows of Osage orange, very similar to what the tribal Indians used in their day. So we're proud to have this bow as a remembrance, having been built since 37.
And the Osage, I said it, the Osage trees, the seeds came from Osage Indian, the Native American tribes land. And an Osage bow was supposedly, during the Native American times, value of a horse.
Wow.
So pretty good stuff.
Al, I just wanted to ask you, so did you get to use that bow?
Oh, yeah.
So would you hunt with it? Just playing with it? Or?
Playing with it, I would say.
Okay.
We'd never used it really to
So
hunt.
was it like cord, or what was it strung with?
Well, initially it was strung with something like rawhide,
Uh-huh.
but of course that went away.
Okay.
Us boys were kind of hard on that. So then it was strung with, a cord of some kind. So initially, Jay, there were two bows, one for each of
Yeah.
us. Yeah.
There's one story yet I want to tell you about the Osage fence. The Osage fence would be cut to about this height, and it didn't stop growing flowers and thistles or thorns on it. So if you remember our cousin Edward Stalkin, Donald Stalkin was his name, his father was Edward, and he liked to come to this farm when he went to college, and he'd spend some of his summer days here and enjoy being here. Well, he was raking the hay with two horses and a dump rake, and along came a bumblebee and bit the one horse in the rump, and the horse, of course, took off, and he wound up in the fence. And Donald was, of course, quite upset about that, didn't know what he was going to do, but here comes Arthur. And Arthur cut the horse loose so they could get him out of the fence. So much for that story, I guess.
And he used his hat to catch the bumblebee or get rid of the bumblebee that was on the horse.
Okay, we're going to move on now to the pasture. Okay, everybody,
Gather round.
I want to first point out that this is the permanent pasture for the cattle. They were here daytime, and they were many times locked up here at night. And this field extends that way to a road, but this is 30 acres for sure, and we think it might have been a little bit more than that. And notice it's got the fence down that side, and there's another one down that side. Now, if you were a little boy, 5, 6 years old, and came out to walk across this pasture, cattle are very curious animals. And I'll tell you, it frightened the heck out of me when I tried to do something like that. Even when I got a little bigger and thought I would want to walk across this to the school, because the school is just over there about 1.5 miles. Now, what you're looking at is the cow barn. And this is the place where most of the action occurred. 5 o'clock in the morning, the cows are all lined up here, ready to go in. We don't line them up, they line up themselves because they know there's food going to be served in there. So they go in, and before they arrive, Arthur has put 1 or 2 handfuls of grain down in front of each stall, and the cattle know which stall is theirs, and they go to their own stall. Now, one of them gets a little ornery and goes to the wrong stall, he gets butted out of there right away. They know where they're supposed to be. Well, then as soon as they're in there, the stanchion, it's called, their head goes between and the stanchion closes and it's locked so they can't get their head out. Well, then along comes Arthur, and here's a cow that gives a good 2 gallons of milk every time it shows up, so he gets a couple big handfuls of feed, and down there is one that gets maybe a half a handful because it doesn't give very much at that time. And of course, in the winter time, they are usually locked into that stall all night long, and they're fed hay. And if you look at the barn, you can see that there's this section up here is where the hay is stored, and back here is where the cows are. And so the hay is forked right into where they are. And then other section up in here has, I'll call them rooms, they're just places for the horses, because they had to have those and take care of them. And I think what's interesting about the horses is they couldn't be on a concrete floor. They had to be on a wooden floor. If they were on a concrete floor, they would become lame and they were not usable. So that was one compensation, I guess. And then there's usually a stall there for the bull and a stall for young calves or cattle that are not producing milk at that particular time. During the windstorms that we had, the cattle were locked in there 24 hours because they couldn't be outside. Arthur would be all covered up with his face, and so he wouldn't be inhaling all of the dirt that came in. And of course, with the livestock, they couldn't do anything about this. And if they got too much dirt in their lungs, they died. So it was very important to care for them. And then he had to carry pails of water in for them, so they had something to drink. The young calves were also taken care of well that way. So I could go on about the barn, but I'm going to tell you one other thing. Those horses, there were 4 of them, 4 stalls. And one day my dad said, Bob, would you like to take that horse out and water it? Sure. I grabbed the rope and started out the door, which was that way, and the horse stepped on my foot. Well, I never wore shoes, so it really hurt. So what did I do? I found a nice hot cow pie and went over and stood in that. And that nice heat relieved the pain from my foot. Good. Anyway, I said this once before, and it got in the newspaper. So I don't think it'll get there today. But so anyway, any questions about the barn?
I think one of the neat things about it, and as I look at some of the relatively younger faces in the crowd, the things we take for granted, and you're talking about the horses and also about the corn harvest. And Arthur Schumacher, while he lived here, never owned a tractor. So it was all horse-drawn. The house foundations were dug out with a slip scraper, which, well, look it up.
Unfortunately, I sent it to the junkyard about 10 years ago, or I would have had it here for you.
Only so much one man can do.
Or remember. Okay, this is where the cows would walk into the barn, and they would all face that direction. And notice right here was a very important thing for the barn. This is, I'll call it the toilet, because that's where they did their business. And in the wintertime, this would be full by the end of the day, and we'd have to clean it all out. In the summertime, those that just couldn't wait, we'd have to clean theirs out too. And all of the manure then was taken and usually piled over here, and it stayed there until we had a place in the field where it could be spread, and then it was put on a manure spreader and taken out there and spread. Now, I think at this time, Alvin's going to talk about milking.
Well, Bob has already pointed out that the cows were in stalls there and a gutter behind, and Dad would go from cow to cow with a milking machine. That was called a surge milking machine. And first thing you did to prepare the cow for milking would be to take some hot water and wash the cow's udder. And then you would put the milking machine on there, and these were like rubber cups that went up over the cow's teat, and that cup would oscillate, and when it oscillated, the milk would come into the canister of the milking machine. So when the cow was finished, which took about 10 minutes, they would take the milk out of the milking machine and pour it into a pail, and that's where Bob and I got to work. We had to carry that pail from the barn to the milk cooling house. So we put the milk in an 8-gallon can and then put the can into the 60-degree water to keep the milk wholesome. Now, a lot of these regulations were established by the Chicago Board of Health. They were very, very strict about cleanliness, sanitation, and the handling of milk. The barn walls had to be painted. They couldn't be scaly. They were very well kept, and the milk was carried in pails over to the milk cooling house, and there it was put in the cans. I think we'll see that cooling house someplace along the tour today, but it was very important to follow the regulations of the Chicago Board of Health. Now, there were dairy farmers that didn't ship their milk to the grade A market in Chicago, but they got a premium. Dad got a premium for having the quality of milk, and he was wise for doing that. Other farmers just milked their cows, put it in a can, and shipped it to the cheese factory, and they could use that quality of milk, whereas the Chicago Board of Health, they really put down strict rules and orders that we had to follow. And Dad did a good job of doing that.
So how did he clean the milking machines and the pails and
Okay.
sanitation that important?
All right. In the milk cooling house, there were 2 tubs that were about 2 foot across, a round bottom, and that 2 tubs were the washing tubs. One was for washing, where you used soap, and you washed the utensils, and you washed all the rubber parts of the milking machine in the first tub. The second tub was for sterilization, and that was usually a chlorine type sterilization. The first tub had a kerosene heater under it. So when you went to milk the cows, you'd light that heater and warm up the milk, or warm up the water, so you'd have wash water, and you'd have something that was clean, and you could wash the utensils. So you had the milking machine, you had pails, and you had a milk stir that would be used to help cool the milk. Now, that was kind of a unique thing that Dad did. Initially, there was a windmill, but Bob and I would remember that the windmill was there, but it was gone. We'll see the steel pieces where the windmill was setting, but the pump the water out of the well was oscillating up and down. So Dad put a chain on the top of that, a bar across, that went into the milk cooling house, and then that worked like this, and here was a stir that was going up and down, which cooled the milk much quicker than just setting the 8-gallon can in the water. And it worked. Yeah.
How much milk would they get a day, more or less?
Well, Bob used the term like 2 gallons. The better cows had 2 gallons twice a day. And, you know, we soon filled 6 or 8 cans that were in that cooling tub. And the next morning, early, the truck would come by, insulated truck, and pick up the cans of milk and take them to Wilmington, where it was then taken on to Chicago for processing.
Can you tell us about the types of cows that you had? Did you have all the same type of cow, or did you have, you know,
Well,
what made these cows special?
Well, I think, you know, my father learned from his father that the Holstein breed of cows gave the greatest amount of milk and were easiest to take care of. Their temperament was better. So that's where father learned good husbandry of taking care of the cattle so that they would get a good feed and good care. And the Holstein was a primary breed that was used for the fluid milk industry. The other breeds were used for maybe the cheese factories.
Well, I got a couple follow-up stories on that. Anybody know who Gene Schaff was or is? Well, he's a cousin. And his parents couldn't handle him very well at the high school age, so they brought him out to our farm and turned him over to my mother and father, and they were to raise him. Well, the short story is that they couldn't handle him either, so he wound up at a military school. But what he would do, he would go out with his friends at night and come back after my parents went to bed, and then he would go to the milk house and reach down in there with a dipper and get cream. Oh, he loved to swallow the cream. And so my parents never knew that, and I didn't know it either until a few years later when he grew up a little bit. I don't know if he ever grew up, but then another story is my brother was very good at making sure all of the utensils in the milk house were clean and orderly and all. But one time an inspector showed up before he had gotten in there to do anything. And the inspector looked at it and he says, "I'm going to shut you off and not going to have any more milk from you for a month." Boy, did that upset Al. I can understand why, because he is a very clean person and kept everything very clean, but this man showed up at the wrong time. But the inspector said, "I'm going to shut you off for a month." And Al got a little ticked at that, and he says, "You're not going to shut me off. I'm going to put you in the water tank over there." Well, about that time, my mother showed up, and she found out what was going on. She grabbed Al by the ear, pulled him over to the car, and she says, "We're going to go over there and you're going to apologize for him because we need to have that milk check." So anyway, I thought that was kind of an interesting story on him, of course, not about me. I didn't do that.
You were the good son.
Yeah.
I was a good guy, yeah. Well, let's move on to the milk house, we called it.
Some really interesting stories. Did
Good.
the cows that you had on the farm, I assume they basically reproduced and you were able to be self-sufficient just by the cattle, being able to have their own babies. But what did you do with the male cattle when they were born?
Oh, they
For meat?
their tissue, you know, was awful soft because they were just babies. But so we fed them milk for about a week and then sold them for veal. You buy any veal in the store?
Yeah, because they're
That's
baby
what it
cows.
is.
Think it'd be okay if we told them about that sheet of Route 66 back behind me there?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. You want to do that or you want me to?
Well, you do it.
This is where those milk tanks that Al and Bob were talking about, the cans would be in here. The overflow would come out through this notch, and right about behind Bob, as I understand it, was where the trough was. But of course, they'd get your cows muddy. So, 1922, they poured what they called concrete road, which later became, in the 1930s, became Route 66, due for an upgrade. When they tore that out, Arthur went out to the spoil pile and brought in these pieces that you see here. So you just walked over, you're one of the only people in the world to have walked over the original Route 66. Not the latest stuff they call Route 66, but the original one that Arthur brought pieces in to keep the cattle up out of the water by the trough, which would have been back there. So count yourself lucky again.
Well, that was important because, again, we were talking about cleanliness. He wanted to keep his cows in good order, and not only did he have this Route 66 flat concrete here, but he also had it right near the barn where they would go into the barn, and if they had mud on their feet, they'd kind of get it tracked off before they got into the milking stalls.
Well, if we look out here, all you see is trees now, but beyond those trees was the field out there that they raised corn or wheat or oats. You know, this is before soybeans were important because we didn't have a war yet, and they had to have butter, and they made it out of soybeans, so it was white, you know, instead of yellow. And there are other reasons for soybeans, but anyway, they didn't have soybeans as one of their crops, but they did have wheat, oats, barley sometimes. They had a lot of hay because they had all these cattle to feed in the wintertime. So that's what all of this would be. So we've used up about 50 acres in pasture land and building area. So the rest of it is all cultivated. So to cultivate it, horses, of course, what else? And there was a one shear plow, 12 inches. So every 12 inches, this thing would go through the soil, turn the soil over. And as time went on, now he got a two-bottom plow, and he could do that much more. When I farmed in 1950, I had a three-bottom plow. Boy, I thought that was great. But he had horses. I had a tractor, so I could do a lot more than what he did. He would have to work it up, turn it over, and then a disc. Now, don't tell me about a disc, because when I was a little kid, I fell off of one of those and I cut my head. Right back here, I got a scar. But they're important because they break up the soil, and then a drag to level it and do more breaking up of the soil. So they would prepare for planting all of these seeds in that manner. Now, when it came to planting them, we don't go back to where they had a hoe and went out and dug a hole and put them in the ground. We had a machine. And I'll talk about probably a little more modern machine. This one would plant corn. And I used this myself when I farmed for a short period of time. It was a corn planting machine that put so many kernels of corn in the ground at a certain distance. And how you would do that, you had a wire that went the full length of the field, you know, a couple hundred yards or more, and every 40 inches there was a burr. And when this burr passed underneath the container with the corn seed or the soybean seed in it, it opened it up and just so many kernels dropped through. Well, how'd they know how many? Well, there was a plate, and they could only allow so many kernels to go through. So now most of the farmers, when Dad was farming in the 30s, they would be planting every 40 inches 3 kernels of corn. So now you had 3 kernels of corn growing every 40 inches. And when I was flying, I just loved to go over the field at that time of year and see all these little patches of corn coming up. I took my father-in-law up in the plane with me once, and he said, I missed one there. I missed one there. Oh, this guy missed a whole bunch of them, you know. So how did they know how many kernels of corn they should drop? Well, they would go to the corn crib, they would get the best looking ears of corn, shuck them, and then they would put them in, we called it a rag doll. It was just like a sock that you could get wet. After they were set there in a warm place for a while, how many grew and how many didn't. So they would know how many kernels they should drop. If only one would sprout, they wouldn't use that corn at all. And then if it was 2 kernels and they wanted 4 corns there, you know, they had to put about 6 kernels in there to get what they were looking for. So, but this kind of thing all stopped with hybridization. Now they could just be guaranteed by the company that produced this corn that it would grow, and you would get 90, 100% of it would produce. So then when they were only getting maybe 2 or 3 stalks of corn, that means 2 or 3 ears of corn, it wasn't profitable. So they were able to use this guarantee by the seed corn company that the corn would produce. I remember one year when we had a real late frost. I mean late or early, I mean. And it killed the corn the end of August. And all of the hybrid corn that was being produced for seed, it got killed too. So what'd they do? They went to Hawaii and planted it and came back with corn that would produce. So ingenious idea, really not, but it worked well.
How did they cut the hay? How did you guys cut the hay in the fields? You didn't have a tractor.
That's an interesting question. How did you cut the hay in the field? You did all the haying by hand. But still in the 40s, now they had the sickle mowers.
Okay.
And they were 5 or 6 feet usually at that time. And they would just cut it and lay it. And of course, then they had to come up with ways to collect it together so you had a pile of it. They had hay baling too. Well, I should go back, and what I hated was to be the horse driver on the hay rack that loaded the hay, because my brother was the forker right in front of me, and you know who got the piles of hay thrown on them all the time, right?
Not on purpose, right?
So,
I have a question.
yes.
Actually, it's a request for a story. Because I was here last year, and one of the best stories was about what happened at school that one day that it was snowy and cold.
That's his story.
Oh, okay. Well, make sure you tell the story, Alvin.
I shall.
Wait a minute, Bob, you didn't mind telling Alvin's story about the inspector.
Well, I want to go back on what Bob was saying. He was talking about the corn planter, every 40 inches. Okay, that was the length as the planter went across the field. But the trip, every 40 inches, allowed that corn to be planted in a row the other direction. So we could cultivate two directions in the cornfield to help control the weeds. And that was the only control that we had, except, as I mentioned before, that Mother would go to Joliet and get a couple of hired hands to come out and work there to chop the thistles out of the corn. So that adds on to what Bob was talking about, the planting of corn. One other comment I'd want to make, when I got to be, I guess just before moving to Plano and the farm closing down in Elwood, the hired man would be plowing and disking. It was my job to take two horses and a dragster to level the fields, and it was Dad's job to plant the corn. So in order to stay ahead of that, they got me up at 6 o'clock in the morning. I'd get two horses and go out there and drag the field down so that then that was level for Dad to run over it with a corn planter and put the seeds in the ground. So that was my early morning chore before going to whatever grade that was, 5th grade or 6th grade, something like that. Do you want to go on and talk about some of the buildings that were...
Oh, yeah, okay, good idea. First, the corn crib. The corn crib.
Okay.
And on this side of the corn crib was a small grain building. And that was a very important building because in this was a hand sheller, a grinder, and I'm going to call it a cleaner, because that's what it did. It cleaned the grain. So when they would come in with their, let's say, a gallon or 5-gallon container full of wheat or oats or corn, in order for it to work in the planter next year, they had to get all of the straw and all kinds of things out of there that didn't belong as part of a kernel of corn. So there was this machine that blew air 2 directions and blew it out, and it was all clean then and could be used to plant. But at the same time, here comes Arthur with a couple gallon pails, and they take it and put it in these pails and take it into the house for Mom to make flour out of, and any other like cracked corn if you're going to have cornbread or something. So this machine was very important. Al and I loved to operate this machine because it just made a lot of noise and it did a lot of things. And I know our father was happy that we liked to do it and then he didn't have to do it. But the one machine he wouldn't let us handle was the one that ground the corn or the wheat, because he said you might cut a finger off and we don't want that to happen. Anyway, this was an important building, important machines there. Al?
Yeah, and let's go back to harvesting corn. Bob told us about, Dad would be husking 2 rows of corn, and he would take one row and I would take one row. Well, what we did then was throw it in a wagon, and then we'd take the wagon to the corn storage crib. And that was kind of a unique building because it had two sections on each side of like a 12-foot driveway down between them. One section would be 6 feet wide and 30 feet long and maybe 10 feet high. So we come in with the corn, ear corn, and we'd take a shovel and shovel it out of the wagon over into this bin. And the bin was made with 1x6s. I'm talking about the width of a board, 6 inches wide. And the inside was just plain wooden 6-inch boards. The outside building, the whole thing had a roof on it. I should have said that. But the outside of it had 6-inch boards that were cut in like trapezoids. If you all know what a trapezoid is, one lip is down and the other one is up. Well, the purpose of that was when the rain came in, it would go down on the board and drip off the front edge and not the back edge into the corn. The reason that we had to use a corn storage shed was that we'd harvested the corn at about 20 to 25% moisture. And if you tried to store it in a pile with that moisture content, it would get moldy and unusable and black and terrible. So we had to store it in this shed so the air would blow through it and dry it down to 14% moisture or less to give it for a long-term storage, because the cattle wouldn't eat the black kernels if it weren't stored properly. So that was a very unique building. Bob was talking about wheat and oats. Above the building, where there was 2 bins under the roof, and that's where we stored the small grains like oats and wheat. In later years, instead of shoveling it into those bins, we had an elevator that carried the buckets, little buckets of grain up and took it to the top and dumped it, and they went back down the other side and came back and picked up some more grain over the top and dumped it into the proper storage location. Do you want to move on from there to the hog house?
Yeah, talk about the hogs and your experiences there.
Well, hogs were important to the industry, important to the farmer, important to the daily life, because each year in the fall, Dad would take a hog and butcher it and take the meat that we were going to use in the wintertime and put it in a smokehouse. And that smoked the hams and the bacon, and it also allowed for longer storage periods of time. It wouldn't spoil. So that was very important. The other part that was important, you all heard about Mother making pies. You'd need to have lard to make pies. Bob talked about the grinding of the wheat for the flour. So that was the principal ingredients for the pie crust. So lard was rendered and stored in crocks. I think we gave a crock or two to Midewin that was used to store lard. But the other thing that the crock did was that they made sausages. And we made the sausages and cooked them and like ready to eat. We'd put them in the bottom of that jar and pour the hot lard over the top of it, and we could store it in the basement without refrigeration. That just sealed it in. But the other thing we need to talk about, I guess, and Bob would remind me if I didn't say this, is that, little boys sometimes get in trouble, and I guess that's why I have been. My sister and I walked out when I was about 3 or 4 years old or something like that to see the pigs. And oh, those little baby piglets that were only about 6 inches long or something like that, and they were nursing on their mother, and their mother had, numerous little nipples to feed her pigs, and she would have a litter maybe of 8 or 10 piglets. So she'd go up and lay down, and the little pigs would come up and get their meal. Well, I thought that was cute. I really thought those little guys were fun. So guess what? At 3 or 4 years of age, I crawled over the fence and I grabbed one of them. And he squealed. And the mama pig didn't like that. But the mama pig knew why that was squealing, and she came after me. If you ever had a pig take her snout and rub you up and down, you'll know that you wish you wouldn't have been there. But the bad part of it was she had a mouth with teeth. And guess what? She wanted to eat. Well, Irma hollered at Dad that I was in trouble because the hog had pushed me in the corner and was doing this to me. And he came and rescued me. So that was another bad incident, right, Bob?
Yeah, good humor at this time of life.
But I got a scar here on my forehead or around my eye that resulted from that experience.
So many years later, I decided, I was raising pigs, and I decided I would take one and butcher it, and she's hiding already. And in order to scald it, I had an old bathtub, so I put water in there and built a fire under it, and it brought the water up to boiling. And then it was ready to scald the pig so I could get the hair off of it and its outside skin. And so I had a tractor with a loader, and I used that and picked it up and went over to put it in the bathtub there. And my assistant was there, and I said, Diane, grab it by the ears and turn it around. She grabbed it by the ears and they came off in her hands.
Scarred for life.
It had nothing to do with her. It had to do with me, that I should have known better than what I was doing. But anyway, I don't know. I think we've probably told enough stories, haven't we? And
Do we have time for one more?
sure.
I wanted to ask about you asked about the schoolhouse when you were in school and it was a snowy day, Al,
Oh,
and you had some surprise.
yeah.
That was a surprise.
Well, my father went to let me go back that far, went to a one-room school when he was growing up. He was the oldest of the family, of the boys. And their school was a one-room school called the Blue Mound School. The instructor in that school was H.H. Barney. So John, my father's father, met Mr. Barney at the steps of the post office one day. He said, I've got 4 boys in your school, and I want, V-O-N-T, want you to learn them something. And so I think that started what we're so pleased with today. All of you are well educated, and you're doing very well. So we have to thank Grandpa John for insisting that Teacher Bailey was doing the right job in the one-room Blue Mound School in Altamont, Illinois. But then somebody brought up a question about when Bob and I were in the one-room school. Well, Bob was in the first grade and I was in the third grade, but by the time I got to the fourth grade, Bob had already skipped the second grade because he was so brilliant, and so he was in the third grade and I was in the fourth grade. Well, anyhow, along about there at one time, we had some visitors. Some of you know that there's a Statesville prison, Illinois State Prison, just north of Joliet near Lockport. And on one day, about 12 of these guys found their way to get out. But they picked the wrong day. It was cold and snowy and so forth. And they had worked their way down about 12 miles to where our school was located, maybe 14. And here it was in the morning, and we were in there nice and warm. And the prisoners could see that the school there. So guess what? They walked in, and here we were. Miss O'Neill was teaching us, and here come these 14 guys in their prison uniforms. So that kind of scared us, wouldn't you say, Bob?
Now, yeah.
So they were very, very polite. Miss O'Neill kept going with the classes. These 14 guys, they stood around the stove, got warmed up, and feeling good, and left. And that's the story that you were talking about, the visitors we had in the one-room school. I can't believe how courteous those people were. They wanted to get warm, they wanted to get their clothes dried, they had spent the night out in the snowstorm, so you can imagine what kind of condition their striped uniforms was in.
So did they get caught?
Oh, yes. Yeah. I think they were kind of willing to get caught because the weather was horrible. They just picked the wrong day to get out.
So did you guys have to walk the, whatever, you said 1.5 miles to school?
Yes. Yeah, sometimes it was less than 1.5 miles because we could cut across the fields. But if there was crops out in the fields like corn, we couldn't walk through the cornfields to get to where we wanted to go. So we had to walk around the road, which made it 1.5 miles. The other bad news about walking through the fields in the fall or winter time, mostly fall, you had plants that were growing up like this, and guess what was in those plants? Spiders. And so you just had to walk through this forest area with spider nets to get to school. So that made us walk around the road instead of through the fields.
And it was that way over there, like where the bison graze sometimes now?
Yes. So
Our bison handling corral is right across the street from the old schoolhouse. The schoolhouse is gone, but that area is right at the intersection of the road by the center of the bison pastures.
And the name of the school was Stars Grove School. And there's a Stars Grove Cemetery just down the road from that. You know, in these little farm communities, they were autonomous in that, you know, they had their own school, they had their own church, they had their own cemetery. So it was a great family gathering when all of the people would get together. And one of the times when they would get together, of course, was at harvesting of wheat and oats, because there would be a need to go out and cut the standing oats or the standing grain as it had matured, and it would be about 3 to 4 feet high. And they used a reaper to cut it, and it cut the stalks, and it tied the stalks together in a bundle. Well, what happened then was that after it was cut, went up a little incline with a bundle and dropped off the side. Well, you can't leave that head of wheat laying down on the ground if it's raining. So then Bob and I and Dad and the farm helpers would go out and grab these bundles, which were probably about 10 inches in diameter, and would stand them on end to make a shock. That's what we called it. You put about 10 or 12 bundles, and then you'd take another bundle and spread it, and that would make the roof over this. And that allowed the grain to dry in that form. And then after it was dried, it would be the farm community would all band together with a thrashing machine, and they would take the bundles from the field, haul them into the farmstead, and then they would thrash the grain, oats, buckwheat, or whatever it might be, out of the straw, and the straw would get thrown out on a pile, and the grain then would go to the storage shed. You know, you were going to talk about the chicken house.
I'm ready.
Okay, I'll be quiet.
Well, raising chickens was Mother's job. So Verna had to take care of the chickens. But at 5 o'clock in the morning, when Art woke up and got up to start his day, first thing he did was to walk out to the chicken house and turn the lights on. And then he'd put a little feed in and a little water for them and go on and do his own chores after that. Well, that night, before he went to bed, he walked out to the chicken house and turned the lights off. Why the lights? Chickens don't lay eggs unless they got light. You notice now, probably there's no place where they raise chickens for eggs that they don't have the lights on 24 hours a day, because they wanted to produce all that they could. Well, in the beginning, Mom would, in the spring of the year, start gathering together some eggs that she knew were fertile, because there was a rooster in there with the hens and knew that they were breeding. And she would had one room at the end of the chicken house, which was a hatching room. And there were boxes in there with straw in, and she would put the eggs in these boxes. And then their problem was to find a clucky hen. So the clucky hen is one that wants to sit on eggs, and that's what it does, sit on anything until it can get the place where there's eggs. So she'd get those and put them in there. If a chicken decided not to be clucky anymore, she had that figured out too. She had a box she put on top of them so that they were captured in there until they got clucky enough to stay there and take care of the hatching of the eggs. So this occurred February, March into April, and it takes 3 weeks for the eggs to hatch. And she always had White Rock chickens because they had big brown eggs. The chickens would start hatching, and she would help them along a little bit. If they couldn't get out of the shell, she'd take the shell apart so they could get out, and then she would put the chicks out, and the hen would come around and take care of them. Actually, the chicks didn't care at all whether they had a mother there or not, because there was water and there was feed and it was warm, and they didn't have to crawl under the mother again to get warm. So it wasn't long, and the hens were put back to laying eggs or shipped off to market, one or the other. But she would raise these chickens, and the story I tell is that Sunday morning she would have the chicken ready for the oven and stick it in the oven, and we'd go to church, and we came back and the chicken was done and we had dinner all right then. So it was chicken and eggs and milk and custard were main things that we ate because they were very abundant and they tasted good, and there were a lot of them for us. Later on, she got a little modern and she'd order them from Montgomery Ward's, and they would appear at the post office, and the postal people would get on the telephone, "Come and get your chickens, they're keeping us awake," or something. So she'd have to go down and get them. But she made quite a bit of money raising chickens. People remember that I'm going into the 40s now, and this was wartime, and there was no meat in the meat markets, but chicken was off of the ration list, so they could have as many chickens as they wanted to. In fact, people in town started raising chickens so that they'd have their own meat. But she would prepare them for whatever they wanted. If they wanted them all cut up, ready to fry and as pieces, or they wanted them roasted, or if they just wanted the feathers left on them yet, whatever it was, she got paid for what they did. But guess who had to catch all the chickens? I had this long wire that had a hook on the end, and I could hook them by the leg, and I caught my chicken then, and then who had to kill them? I was pretty good with an axe cutting the head off of a chicken. But there were other things there too. When Arthur went out in the morning and turned the lights on, there may have been some critter in there during the night that had killed or maimed some of the chickens that were in there. And, everything, even skunks like chicken. And animals would come in there at night or during the daytime and get them. But weasels was a blood-sucking animal that would get in there and kill the chickens off, maybe several of them in the same night, which wasn't very good. But anyway, what else we got?
At what stage of growth would you eat the chickens?
Oh, 3.5 pounds usually. She had white rocks, and 3.5, 4 pounds was a good weight for a white rock chicken.
Did you let them run around too, or were they?
Yes. Oh, we call them free range, don't we now?
Yeah.
Well, I guess another thing I ought to mention is I told you I had these animals there. Well, one day I put my hand in to get the eggs from under a chicken and pull the snake out. So, anything else you want to?
I do. Well, I have a pretty good idea of some of the chores you both took care of. What were Irma's responsibilities? She was a little bit older than you.
Irma didn't live with us. She was 10 years older than me.
Right.
And when she finished 2 years of high school, and that's all Elwood had was 2 years, she rode a bus every day to Joliet to go to school. And she continued on into the junior high school. By the way, Joliet Junior High School is the first one in the nation. And so then the war occurred, and she never really moved home.
Yeah. Well, she was, like many of you are, destined to go to school and learn something and not just be a housekeeper. She was ambitious. She wanted to do something. So she got her PhD at Iowa State University, and the story after that she worked for the USDA and did quite a phenomenal job of controlling or setting up a procedure to control a very, very difficult critter, and that was the cotton boll weevil. And she was noted for making that happen. But I want to go back to the chicken house. Okay. Is that okay?
Sure.
Yeah. Well, the chicken house was a very important location. not only did the chickens get fed there, we took the corn from the corn crib, ground it, and took it to the chicken. It was at the end of the year, before the next corn crop was harvested, Father would hire somebody to come in to take the corn, which was on ears, and shell the corn off the ears, and then he would sell that to the granary in Elwood. But what did you do with the corn cobs? They became a big pile, and at some time when they kind of rotted down, they'd take them to the field to use them as fertilizer. But the important part of that corn cob was that it was very useful. And it was an important part of the chicken house. It was very useful. I think we talked about Mother going to Joliet and getting, hired labor to come out and help at the farm to hoe and so forth. And there was no outdoor privy. So the only toilet was in the house. Well, you didn't invite these strangers into your house because they had duties that they had to do. And so what did they do for toilet? Well, the chicken house served as a place of shelter because behind the chicken house, they took a tiling spade and made a little slit in the ground, maybe 10 feet long, but only about 6 inches wide. So that's what the gentlemen used for their toilet. But there was no Charmin toilet tissue. So what do you suppose they used? They went to the corn cob pile and picked up corn cobs and used that as their Charmin paper. Now, the wise guys, they got the corn cobs and brought them out, laid them on top of the chicken roof, and let the rain wash the chaff off of them before they were used.
What do you say? Anything you want to talk about yet? We're about out of words.
I was gonna ask Grandpa or Uncle Alvin. You talked a lot about what you did as work, but what were some of the fun or extracurricular activities or ways that you made entertainment on the farm?
Dickie. Our pony. Your pony? Actually, it was a neighbor's pony, and the boys who used to use it got too big, so they got horses. Al and I got to play with the pony, and the pony would come to our house and maybe would stay a month, maybe a couple days, and we just had a good time with it. During the summer season, it was really nice because we could go out in the field and take the lunch out to the men or something for them to drink. And I don't know. We had a pony cart and we had a saddle for it. And what else did we do? Well, not much. I remember our dad trying to help us play baseball. I don't know if Al remembers this or not, but you got to remember that he was much older than most men at that stage in life. And if he would throw the ball and we would hit it, he couldn't run after it. He had to just kind of chug along to get out there to get it. And I couldn't understand then why he wasn't running after the ball, but now I'm old enough to know why he couldn't do that. Al?
Yeah, well, we had fun, two boys out in the farm area. We did lots of things together, and we enjoyed doing those. And it was fun working with our father. He was such a dedicated, hardworking individual that we just felt very good about being around him and being a part of the family and seeing what he had accomplished over the years. It was just a real enjoyable growing up period of time. And we have to be thankful for that over the years. And we're thankful for you all being here. We're so proud of you being here to support this and make this happen and share alike the individual stories. You don't want to hear about the corn cobs, but
No, don't tell that again today, at least.
Al,
well,
you
yes.
Fairview Farm on your walking stick, and I wondered if there's a story behind your walking stick.
Oh, yes.
I love that it says that.
I was so fortunate that the people here at Midewin made this walking stick for me. Guess what wood they used? Osage orange. And it's very strong and very stable, and I'm so proud of what they did here to identify it. They put my initials up here on this part, and then down here they wrote Fairview Farm, which is the name of the farm. Bob referred to it, the sign that was outside, and that is the name of the farm. And on the side here, they did such a good job of drawing and embedding in here the picture of the barn and a picture of the house. And I look at that, and I look at the pictures here, and they did an excellent job of getting the pitch of the roof just perfectly as it is in reality. I want to back up for one more egg story.
Uh-oh.
You know, Mother would harvest the eggs, and of course there'd be more than what we could utilize as a family. So she would take them to the A&P store, the Great Atlantic and Pacific grocery store in Joliet. And if she sold them to them, she got 10 cents a dozen. If she traded it for whatever they bought, like salt and items out of the grocery store, she got 12 cents a dozen for them. So it was a source of income, and she utilized that as a good move. The other thing that she did with the eggs is that the hired men that were so good about returning and making things happen and doing a good job, they got $1 a day plus for the week. They got a dozen eggs, a whole 10 cents more.
And now a dozen farm eggs costs $5 in this area.
Really?
$5.
Wow.
For a dozen.
Wow.
You want to come back and get this chicken coop back in operation there, Al?
Not right away.
Pretty
No.
lucrative.
Yeah, at $5 a dozen.
There's nothing that tastes like a farm fresh egg. You just can't get those in the store, can you?
No, I agree with you. Yeah. Let's have some questions. Bob has the answers.
I got one on behalf of my mother. She wanted me to ask about how you guys learned to drive.
Oh.
I think the grandchildren deserve to hear that.
You gotta hear it. Go ahead.
Oh, are you going to let me do it?
Sure.
Well, we would ride with our father in the truck as he would go to Elwood either to purchase something or deliver some grain. And he was so kind to us that we could sit on his lap, and as we come down Highway 66, we could steer the truck. And believe it or not, we did a good job of staying in the correct lane. And that was fun. We really thought that was a great doing with Dad. Well, that was all good, but he kind of looked at it that, we got to learn how to drive this. So in, I don't know, the late 30s, Bob was like 7 years old maybe, and I was like 9. But we were too short to, drive the truck. So one of us would handle the steering wheel, and the other one to handle the brake and the gas. And it was
On the floor.
On the floor. So one was laying on the floor, and the other was on his knees up running the steering wheel. And we were safe. Yes.
Did you trade?
Oh, yeah. We were fair. It was fun. Guy on the floor had all the work, and he couldn't see where he was going. The guy on top, he had to be careful not to run into one of these trees. So that was enjoyable. We're standing right near the front. You can see there's a little concrete square here, and that's where the steps went up to get to the porch. The house was up maybe 3 feet, and we had like 4 steps to get from the ground level up to the front porch. And it was a beautiful house. The front porch ran all the way across the top here. It had a wooden floor in it, and it was enjoyable to be out there as little kids to play on that area. Okay, then you stepped into the living room, which is on my right side here, and behind that was the dining room, and across from that, above the cistern, was the kitchen. And the kitchen was unique for the day in that it had 2 stoves. One was an electric stove, which was modern at that time. Not many people had electric stoves, but there was also a cook stove. And the cook stove was used in the wintertime, and the electric stove virtually was used in the summertime. But then it was Bob and my job is to go out and gather the wood, which was in a pile out there that Dad had prepared it, and we had to bring it in to Mother, who then kept the stove going. And then from the stove coming toward us, right above this coal bin here, was the master bedroom. Between the kitchen and the master bedroom was a modern bath facility for the day of 1924. So not many homes had an inside bathroom. In fact, when we moved from here in 1940 to Plainwell, Illinois, we stepped backwards because the only thing we had was a nice little wooden shack in the backyard to use as a toilet. So we stepped backwards, and then Dad in 1 year changed that around. He rebuilt the house, and we had an inside bathroom again and running water. Above the first floor was the 2 bedrooms, one for Irma that would have been on the east side, and the other one across the hall was for the hired man, which most of the time was our Uncle Bert. And then out over the porch here is where us boys slept in a bed above the porch. But in the wintertime, it was really cold. So we moved the bed into the hallway upstairs, and that's where we used for a bedroom. Anything else, Bob?
No, I think you made the point that this was one of the most modern houses at that time. This house was moved after the government bought it, the property, and it was taken over near the cemetery and Grandma's house over there, and there was a little area that was for houses for the military officers who were here on guard duty for the munition plant.
It was heartbreaking to see the house get lifted and moved. I was here at that day when they put it on the truck and took it away. But, you know, they had to utilize it. The government owned it, and it was a good move to see it used rather than just damaged. A lot of the houses that were not in good shape, they were just bulldozed down, and they served no purpose. You can see the outline of what the cistern looked like. Now, the water that filled the cistern came from the roof, from rain. And it was soft water. In that water, there was a little pump that pressurized the lines going up to the bathroom and the kitchen, and the pump took the water up there. There was also a little fire hot water heater I remember many times going down there and stoking it, putting some more wood in it to heat the water so that Mother had water to wash with that was warm and to wash the dishes. And of course, we had to take a bath once in a while.
I'm so glad that we had a turnout like this.
Oh, yeah.
It is really nice. And Al and I are in the generations ahead of most of them. I don't think there's anybody equal to us.
No. How could there be?